Welcome back, everybody, to a very unique podcast because I'm interviewing somebody that I have met 10 minutes ago. Good morning, Rebecca, or in Ontario, good afternoon.
Thanks very much. Hi.
I just think it's fascinating that we've been connected by a third party, Tiago, who listened to one of my podcasts and reached out. He ended up in spam. And I was just searching through there, looking for something else, and I saw this, and I hauled it out of there, and I thought it just looked intriguing. And so then I had a gentle scratch, making sure I wasn't going down some, nasty rabbit hole, and then checked you out, and you were real.
I am, in fact, real. It is true. From halfway around the world. I am so glad that something caught your attention. Tell me more about what that was.
Well, I'm a very selfish person, Rebecca. So, I looked at this and I thought, do I want to do this? It's this piece around the imagination and collective imagination. That was a thing. And I thought, okay, this is something I want to learn more about. I'm always interested in people pushing the boundaries. So that was the hook. That was the hook. So before we go there, Rebecca, who are you?
Did you say who am I or how am I?
Both. Let's do how are you and then who are you? Okay? How you doing?
Fair. We were joking about the accent and all of a sudden you tripped me up. So I am Canadian. I am 27 years into a strategy facilitation company. So I have an entrepreneurial bent to me. My client base tends to be the boards and CEOs of large mission-driven organizations in any sector. So that might be private or public or nonprofit. And I'm working with boards and C-suites on strategy development. And so in that space, this emphasis on imagination might be a bit unexpected. So from a work perspective, that's who I am. And my practice really is about helping people reimagine their next chapter collectively. And I do that across those teams and groups that I just mentioned, but also for individuals, often from amongst the same groups of people, but who approach me for coaching initially one-on-one. But what happens is I often create group experiences for them through retreats and that kind of thing, so that they can spark ideas off of one another. And so I'm really in the business of creating good group experiences. And when I'm not doing that, I'm usually traveling or planning travel or hanging out with we've got 4 grown kids and 2 grandbabies that all come and go very frequently. So there's a lot of family stuff going on, both in the background and foreground of what I'm up to. But business-wise, that's what I do.
Rebecca, you've got a PhD in what?
The cheeky answer is in nothing that I use right now, but it's actually not completely true. I did it almost 25 years ago in one of the first interdisciplinary PhD programs that Canada had. And that is actually notable because very typical of me that I can't choose or specialize or focus sufficiently to pick one discipline, even for a PhD. And so I did it in something called Sustainable Rural Communities. And my focus was on the accessibility of midwifery services to rural women in Canada. And the reason for that was that I used to travel a lot to Africa and had to stop my traveling job in order to have our kids. There was nothing safe during pregnancy that could also ward off malaria at that time. So I had to pick something to study that was closer to home, which was frustrating to me. And so ended up plugging into that. And the reason that it's been terrific is that I think the theme of being a midwife to people has actually been a bit of a motif of my life since then. But also it's been important in helping me see issues from the perspective of people whose voices and perspectives are often muted. And so I'm usually looking for the people who aren't invited to the table or who don't speak a lot in the meeting, or, whose perspectives just seem to be underrepresented. That's what that ended up being about. but it also has opened some doors for working pretty extensively with universities as strategy clients in my practice, but I'm certainly not someone who has followed a typical academic stream coming out of that academic work.
Why don't some people get heard?
Oh, there's so many reasons. I think one of them is that there's just all kinds of reasons why certain individuals or groups of people are sidelined from the dominant narrative in whatever setting you're in. And that has to do with power, it has to do with legacies and habits and preferences and just all kinds of reasons where it isn't. It might be that it's not safe for them to speak up. It might be that they have never been invited to that party. It might be that the ways in which they've been invited to participate are so either unsafe or foreign or unexpected to them that they just haven't been able to be heard in certain ways. And it can be really practical things. It doesn't have to be, massive systems. It could be something as simple as, people designing research. I don't know. I'm thinking about with young moms, and they set a meeting time of 1:30 in the afternoon when all of those moms have kids napping, and the moms don't show up, and then their voice isn't heard. It doesn't have to be some nefarious thing or some big system. It might just be somebody who just didn't give it enough thought. And other times it is actually legacies of racism and colonialism and sexism and all kinds of other isms that have put us in this place. So I like to pay attention to those ideas and those people that are underrepresented, but also recognizing the privilege that I bring into a situation, so that even just who I am and how I show up might serve to silence people rather than creating space for them. So I'm not separate from that story.
It doesn't take much sometimes, does it, to silence people? Mm-hmm. I facilitated a conversation with about 100 people. Oh, this might be 12 months ago. And I said we were 2/3 the way in to my time slot, which was about 2 hours. And I said, okay, the rest of the time here now, we're only going to hear the voices of people who have not spoken yet. So anybody who's spoken, you've had your turn. And there was sort of a bit of like, what? I said, to be clear, anybody who hasn't spoken yet, you now have the floor. And I got a little bit of feedback from people who had spoken. So I haven't finished yet. I said, you have. It's done. And it was one of the best things I've ever done in facilitation, because it really encouraged the quiet voices to speak. And I think you and I would know that the quiet voices are often the really smart people.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love it from a facilitation point of view, because I'm big into facilitation design and finding ways to make that happen. And I appreciate that. It makes me think of another example where I had a CEO who got up and said, when the small groups that you've just been working in come back to report back, I want the person, I don't remember if he said the youngest person or the person who was youngest at the company needs to be the person that we hear from. And it just changed, it changed the dynamic quite a bit. And I think the other thing it makes me think is that often when we're doing some sort of, engagement and trying to hear what people think, often it's based on the majority messages, like the most repeated themes get into the final report, and sometimes it's not the most often repeated things we need. It might be that one thing that just is really wise, right? Where you just go, ding, that's the thing, that's what we should listen to. And so I like helping groups kind of decide what makes an idea good before we get into those ideas, because sometimes it's not the common idea, it's the uncommon idea that we really need to listen to. And if we're only just counting responses, it's not going to get us there.
100%. And one of our work, Rebecca, with collective intelligence is to harness the difference. Yeah. And so we spend a lot of time curating teams that are really diverse. They have a commonality in that, there'll be, we work in a professional setting. And it's about trying to harness that gap between you and I, that little thing there that neither of us would come up with.
Yeah.
And you've got to pay so much attention to spotting it, because it's generally really subtle, and it's not waving its hands about going, look at me, look at me. You've got to be really conscious of it and go, hang on, just this, what was that? And it's amazing how you've got to concentrate and be looking for it while doing work.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the challenge. I mean, as the facilitator in particular, there are a lot of signals, a lot of noise, a lot of other things on your mind, right? And so I think being able to be fully attentive to those emerging possibilities takes a particular ability to listen and watch for them that is a little bit potentially different from the skills that it takes to design the session or to keep time or to manage the room in some other way. And so the multitasking of that and the task switching of that can be, a big ask for people.
Yeah. So so you were working in Africa doing what?
I worked for World Vision. I was the kind of the liaison person between the Canadian office of World Vision and the Eastern African offices. And so I was really young. I was fresh out of school in my early 20s. And had 5 really good years of that to launch my career. And that really got me interested in some of these marginalized voices, certainly in travel, although that predated that job, and in, lots of other issues related to diverse ways of knowing and being in the world.
And then what was the trigger for you to start Sage Solutions is the name of the business, right?
It is, yeah.
What was the catalyst of that?
I wonder if there's such a thing like in chemistry of a gradual catalyst. I picture a catalyst being sudden, and this feels like something that gradually emerged, even though I tend to be quite intentional in the way that I do things, but it emerged gradually in the sense that I was, I'll fast forward a bit from what we were talking about, but I found myself at home with 4 kids, delighted when someone would call and ask me to do a project, and the way that it would be decided really was, does this sound interesting? Would it use my brain, and can I find childcare? It really wasn't the most sophisticated filtering system, nor did I set out. It wasn't like I left my corporate job to become an entrepreneur. It was that my primary responsibilities, my primary allegiances were at home, but I had all kinds of curiosity and interest and very little time. And people that I knew from my previous networks and things would call me and ask me to do different things. And I got to a place where I looked at this kind of dog's breakfast of a CV that I had developed and went, oh, what is it that's I don't know if you've ever thought of the difference between competence and calling, and I'm competent at a lot of things, but I really wanted a sense of what's the common thread across these, where clients were saying to me, you're the best one for that we know. Lots of other people can do some of these other things that we've also hired you to do, but this seems to be a real superpower of yours. And for me, that was group facilitation. And so that gradually became an area of expertise for me. And as my children got older and I started to say, oh, maybe it's time to, I don't know, get a real paid job or something, I realized that the consulting that I had started doing just off the side of my life ticked enough of the boxes for me that I wanted to become much more intentional about it and make that a conscious choice of primary use of my time. And so it evolved in terms of that. And there have been different chapters of it over the years. Probably every 4 or 5 years, I kind of reinvent it. But yeah, I mean, that has been the case for me for about 28 years. And what we do now is under that umbrella of helping organizations and individuals reimagine their next chapter. But the path we took to get there was largely through strategy development, stakeholder engagement, help policy development, those kinds of things, working with governments and large nonprofits, et cetera. But now I've got a bit more latitude to shape it in ways that I'm finding interesting. I was finding it interesting all the way along, but there's a certain level of freedom that comes from having been at it a while that has been fun to choose how to be even more selective and focused about what I want to spend my time doing.
The young woman who started work in Africa and today, what are the changes? What's different?
It's a really interesting question. It's easier for me to think of what's the same. I think I have more. I've always been someone who had a lot of choices, and I've stayed true to being someone who also cares about the purpose or the mission or the why of things. And so I think the privilege that I have and the purpose-driven side of who I am has not changed. I think probably what has changed is that I was going to say, I wonder if I'm less idealistic. I don't think I'm less idealistic, but I may be more pragmatic at the same time. 30 years of work and, raising people and going through stuff as life happens, I think does sort of maybe shave off some rough edges, that kind of thing, I probably had some clearer ideas of how I thought the world worked and how the world should work. And I'm probably much more living in the gray zone between black and white than I was when I was younger. And also have a better understanding of the complexity of what it takes to sort of nudge change along. Even complexity of how decisions are made in groups and how power works, and just all the things I hope that I've learned along the way. But I think in my essence, I remember my first boss there commenting, because I was very young to be in the job I was in, and he was kind of gently encouraging me to kind of show up. Like, he didn't say it this way, but I know he wanted me to seem older, right? And I think because I am an energetic, enthusiastic kind of person, neither he or I could have known that, here we are almost, 30 years later, more than 30 years later, and I'm still that person, and I think he and I were both interpreting it as youthfulness.
Right.
And there's maybe that element to it, but it turns out I'm old and I'm still like that. So, I think there's some continuity that shows up more prominently than difference maybe.
Rebecca, I'm just going to check my power supply. 2 seconds. I'll keep this recording.
All right.
Because the screen has just changed, and I'm just concerned my power's turned off.
Sure, no problem.
Now, I'm very pleased to say the power's off, and so we can continue. Okay.
All right.
I want to come back to this grey zone of the uncertainty and the complexity. And it's something that we take notice of more and more, that at the moment, I think lots of leaders, maybe not the leaders, but lots of people are looking for certainty and are just not comfortable with the uncertainty or the grey zone, and not actually spotting that it's complex. And complex issues need a totally different way of dealing with them than things that are black and white. How have you noticed with people's The world is becoming more complex. How what are you spotting with people in this complex world?
Yeah. A lot of the work that I do has to do with adaptability. I work with an adaptability assessment that measures and assesses the level of adaptability present in an individual or team. And so what I'm about to say comes out of that work pretty heavily. And one of the things I'm noticing is just the accelerated pace of change. And so if people are still operating from an understanding that they can sort of wrap their arms or their minds around all of it, we can't. And so if you've been somebody who has been always kind of the smartest person in the room because of all of the facts you can cram into your head, ChatGPT can do that better than you right now. So like, what else could you offer in that sense? I think I also notice it in terms of if people, I remember a conversation early in COVID actually, where somebody said to me, well, I just don't do digital. And I said, well, I hope that you enjoy your retirement because, you don't have the option during a global pandemic to be anti-digital, but it symbolized something bigger than that for me. And that is folks who, when things are turbulent, they kind of, turtle and wait for things to calm down. And I think if you are waiting for the dust to settle and things to, quote, get back to normal, you have now basically made yourself irrelevant. I think we can't wait for the storm to settle or the weather to improve. We have to learn how to surf the waves that are there. And so I think building our skills in adaptability and recognizing that it is a skill set is helpful. And I think the other thing I know is helpful is that people who can adapt in ways that align with what they are already good at and enjoy do better than the people that are being forced to adapt or are forcing themselves to adapt in ways that don't suit them. And so there's a lot of good news around adaptability. And that is one, in part, that if you can find a pathway toward it that aligns with what's important to you and what you're good at, people actually like it. It's those folks are the ones that thrived during periods of volatility and disruption. And so it doesn't have to be that this accelerated pace of change makes us all kind of slump our shoulders and think that all is lost. It's like, no, we all have to adapt. And if we focus on that as a negative, it's going to sap our energy. But if we can find a pathway through that, where, say, oh, I'm good at this. I love this. Spending my time doing this is, whatever it is helpful to me. I find that this assessment that I work with can give people some evidence-based tools to say, oh, there is a pathway through this fog that allows me to be more fully me and doesn't force me into some sort of, depressing sort of, or like difficult thing. And not to say it's not difficult, but I think, the example I always use here is that I'm not someone who loves spreadsheets. I'm not very good at Excel. And if you put me in a team and said, okay, you're going to be the Excel queen on this team, like I could do it. I just would hate it. And, I could work really hard and move from a 4 out of 10 to a 6 out of 10, but you'd be better to find an 8 out of 10 and move them up to a 9. And they would be your awesome spreadsheet king or queen, and let me do the things I'm good at. And so I think partly when we can align the requirements of dynamism in our context with what we are already delighted by and wired to do, it's not so much the change that bothers us. It can sometimes be what we're being asked to do in response to that change. That it's not always that, but I think it's what we're being asked, but also our expectations. That if we are expecting the context to be static, and it's not for a long period of time, we're kind of coming at it annoyed already. And I think if we can adjust our expectations that this is what living ecosystems do, and that it doesn't have to be framed negatively as, uncertainty and volatility. It could be framed as growth and adaptability and responsiveness and nimbleness. That just has a really different, I'm not, a fan of sort of toxic positivity here, but I think there's a really different frame that allows us to tap into something much more generative and interesting in there.
What was that term? Toxic positivity.
The people that are just like, it's great, you're doing so well, and it's just like constant rah when you go, really look around. I want to take a good hard look at what's really happening, and not be too Pollyanna about it. But I actually think how we ask questions and how we frame a situation really affects how we approach it. And I think there's ways to do that feel more life-giving than another change management initiative.
Look, I was just intrigued with that term. I've never heard it before, and yeah, that Pollyanna thing, it just jars, right? It absolutely jars. Yeah. So, it's interesting. I've worked with a guy in the UK, Rich Alderton, who is working in a similar space around helping companies become more adaptive. And he said, if a company can be adaptive, we don't need to restructure anymore, because we'll be adapting all the time, little by little, and making the changes every day to, for the future. I see companies, certainly here in New Zealand, that just sit still and then go through these massive restructures, which causes so much trauma. It takes years to get over it, and often lose their best people, lose momentum. And I believe it's because they haven't been adapting as they go along. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Rebecca, let's come round to this thing that I'm just dying to get into, is this imagination piece. That's the thing that's really alive for me at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Where did that come from?
I think it came from realizing that I could be in rooms of people who were using the same words, but they weren't watching the same movie in their heads. And part of what I do as a facilitator is help what's in your head be made visible to other people in a room of people, so that everyone can look at all of it and go, how aligned are we? And so there's that element of imagination, meaning when I speak a certain term like respectful behavior or something, that what I'm picturing may or may not match what you're picturing. Hold that alongside every strategic planning session anybody's ever been at that has mission, vision, and values. And vision becomes a statement on the wall of your cubicle, and we spend our time wordsmithing one sentence. And what I am more interested in doing is listening to people's more detailed, long form, vivid picture of what they're trying to create together. Because I've had enough moments in facilitation where, for example, I might say to a board, what's your key metric of success? And once I worked with a food organization, they provided emergency food, and they said, oh, clearly the number of people accessing emergency food. And I said, okay, do you want that number of people to go up or down? And half the board said up and half the board said down. And we went, that's the problem, is that the vision of success was actually, driving with the parking brake on, right? Because the vision people had was different from one another. So that's one element of the collective imagination, is making sure that we can describe the picture in our heads enough to see if it's in alignment with other people. I think that's one place it came from. I think another place is that I think imagination has a really bad rap because we think of it as something we grow out of. It's something for children. It's something fluffy. It's rainbows and unicorns. And I'm learning as I dig further into this work how much more and deeper and strategic it is than just that. And even if it is just that, I think many of us could stand a little more of that. So we're learning the value of lightness and play and humor, yes, but also some very serious things have been attributed to a failure of imagination, including 9/11, including the economic collapse of 2008. If you read some of the reports coming out of some very, studious people's offices at federal government level, say in the United States, they talk about a failure of imagination causing their preparedness for disasters of various kinds to be limited because if you didn't even conceive of the possibility of something, you won't work to guard against it. But a more positive flip on that is the motivation that can come from a really vivid picture of the future you want, because I believe that we shape the future. We're not only just handed it. And so if we don't have a sense of what we're trying to work toward in some detail, we, kind of waffle around a bit. But if we have a really vivid, detailed picture of a motivating future, particularly together, we are much more likely to get there. And so there's a motivational element to this too. So yeah, there's lots of other things I could get into, but those are three of the sort of pathways in that caused me to get to that place.
I love that example with the metrics, because when you ask that question, I said, well, it must be to get the numbers down, because if the numbers go up, it's a failure. The system, we're having to do more and more. But I could also sit there on the board and go, well, it's to do more of this, and both of those responses are correct, and both of them are wrong, depending on the lens you put on. Yeah. So I love that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you get pushback from people thinking that imagination is a plaything?
I don't think people, for example, I was giving a talk to a regional government council recently, and when they asked me to give them the agenda and I used the word imagination, they changed the word. And I thought that was very interesting. So sometimes the pushback is not overt, but they changed it to something that sounded much more serious, and they were willing for me to talk about it. They just didn't want me to call it that. And so there is a bit of a sales pitch problem in some ways. I mean, it's interesting to me that was a hook for you, because I think it might for other people be maybe the opposite. I don't know. I don't think people see it as a serious business tool. And so sometimes I find myself talking to people about imagination as one of the most underused strategic tools in our toolkit, because I think that much of what we do in traditional strategy building in business is based on kind of a rear view mirror way of looking at things, where we look at our previous strategy, how did that go? We look at our data, which is based on past performance, all really important. I mean, I'm a fan of evidence-based decision-making for sure, but I'd like to add in another sort of tool set that is more future oriented. And what I noticed is, because imagination does tend to be seen as something we grow out of, and in fact, I have a sticker on my desk that says, imagination is something we grow into, not out of. I don't think it's like a muscle that has been underworked. And so when I do ask people to describe in detail the picture they have in their heads of the future they'd like to create together, it's a really hard question. It's like if you ask someone what they want, and it sounds really basic, but when you ask someone, they're like, oh, geez, I don't even know, right? And so it's actually harder than you think. And it's not, if I say we should all be more imaginative, I'm not actually advocating that we all, sit down and sort of scrunch up our foreheads and concentrate really hard and hope that we develop more creativity or something. So I think helping people develop tools to get there becomes quite important. But the neuroscience behind this is super interesting. One element of it is that there's a reason why adults have the possibility of being more curious, more creative, more imaginative than children. And it's because we imagine out of our memories.
Yep.
And so because that's true, as adults, we have amassed more memories than a little kid has. We have more fodder for this. Like we in theory, we have more to draw on that could make us more imaginative. And so I don't have any reason to believe that adults shouldn't or can't be more creative or curious or imaginative than kids. And it turns out that when you look at some of the work on curiosity, for example, we may be as curious or more, but we're very targeted about it as adults. We go to Google or wherever, ChatGPT, and look something specific up. And I think kids are better than we are at exploratory curiosity, which helps in this space. And I think the other thing that helps, if you can think about, I often think about skills that we treat as individual that are actually collective. So curiosity would be one, imagination would be another, where we think of it as something we have to sit down and kind of noodle about in our own heads. And it actually doesn't work as well that way as it does when we do it with other people. We've probably all had the experience of having an idea made better by other people adding to it, for example. And if you look at, there's a really interesting book called The Geography of Genius, and it looks historically at where pockets or epochs of genius have happened over history. And it's never the lone brilliant, whatever scientist in his lab alone.
In isolation.
Never is. And so it's, you think about Vienna in the Baroque music era, or you think about Silicon Valley right now, or you think about Renaissance Italy in Florence. Those are collective situations. People locate in communities of creativity. And so, and even for kids, I mean, playing dress up by yourself is fine, but playing dress up with your friends is way better. And so I'm, as a group person, I'm really interested in helping people figure out how to tap into the group energy that can help their own imagination be even more delightful to them, or get them faster and better to the places that they want to go.
What's the difference between curiosity and imagination?
Ooh. I feel like they're very related, and I do often, use them, as you would have heard, interchangeably in the same paragraphs. But I feel like curiosity is about finding out something, right? It's about asking a question and trying to find the answer to it. And I think imagination can have that element, right? Where you go, imagine if I were able to solve X problem, wouldn't that be amazing? And then my curiosity kicks in to help me figure out how to do that.
Yep.
But the imagination piece, I think initially is coming up with the destination almost, or the wouldn't it be cool if? And then the curiosity is more about maybe the how, or the, let me look into that. So I feel like they are very related, and they're skill sets that are quite complementary. But I feel like curiosity has a question answering dimension to it, and imagination can, but sometimes imagination is about creating a picture that doesn't have to be right or accurate or have an answer. It may be more of a preference or a dream, or it has kind of some other elements to it that I think are, maybe complementary with each other.
I wrote down here, I think it might be, because when I asked that question, I thought, there is a difference, what is it? And what I wrote down when you were talking there is liberating. Because you don't, as you said, you don't have to get it right. It's you can imagine something that's not sensible or practical or whatever. You can just imagine it. And then, and then go from there. Curiosity. So we work with the term curiosity a lot.
Yeah.
And, if your bio had said curiosity, I'm not sure I would have followed up on this. It was the imagination piece. It was the thing and going, I need to learn more about that. How do we build the muscle, Rebecca? How do we build this muscle?
Yeah, such a good question. I actually just wrote a blog series on this, so it's fresh in my mind because I had people saying, like, how do we do this? And I feel like there's ways of creating the conditions that make it more possible first. And one of the things that I think we need to do is pause, stop. It's really hard to be imaginative in, like, when we're moving a million miles an hour and noisy. Now, that stop doesn't have to be a year-long sabbatical. It could be a 10-minute pause or a deep breath. You know, there's different scales of this. But I'm not sure that our imagination kicks into action in really busy, noisy, fast-paced environments. So I think there's a pause piece. I also think there's all kinds of ways to do it. So I'm just going to give you a few ideas. I think another one is to expose ourselves to a variety of people and settings. And so if you have the privilege to travel or to be exposed to really diverse teams, for example, not just because they're diverse, but because you've actually leveraged that diversity and you've learned from it and you've had conversations about, you know, different people's experiences. It's not just showing up around the table, but actually learning from that diversity. Or maybe you haven't had those opportunities, but maybe you're really widely read and maybe you get really into really cool fiction that transports you to other places. I think that exposure to a variety of settings ignites something that isn't ignited when we stay on the same pathway. You've probably heard of people using the example of, you know, igniting their creativity by taking a different route to walk to work and, you know, that kind of stuff. It's the same kind of idea in our brain. And I think a follow-on to that exposure and the variety of inputs is finding people that ignite your imagination, not in a that could never happen. You know, it's like the vision that, you know, you write as a company that will never come true, but imagination closer up that allows you to say, huh, that person is very interesting, or they have a really great life, or I love how they run their business, or whatever. You have these role models that are inspiring that allow you to say, imagine if I could be a little more like them. And so it's not in a really distant or negatively comparative way. But my friend Lisa O'Neill, who's a Kiwi, I mentioned her to you before we came on air here. She's from Levin. She talks about borrowing a teaspoon of this person and a teaspoon of that person. And I think there's something imaginative about that, actually, that says, imagine if I could learn that. Imagine if I could put a little more of that into my life. And so I think sometimes it does require us sitting down and actually describing a dream we have, right? But other times, and we can, you know, sort of riff off of that and go into some really exotic kinds of possibilities. But I think sometimes it can be something as proximate as, imagine if I let myself go there the way that person has, what would that mean for me? So there's ways of, you know, journaling can help, walking can help. There's just all kinds of ways to trigger our creativity. Having a good coach, I have a set of cards that I sell that are called possibility packs that have some good questions that nudge us into that space. So you know, there are lots of tools in the toolkit. But I think it starts from acknowledging that it is a tool we could actually benefit from, or a muscle we could benefit from strengthening. I think that's the first step.
Mm. Who doesn't like this?
That's such a great question. I love it. I would think that, I mean, I probably don't get in a lot of rooms with people who don't like it because they don't call me, right?
But there'll be some people in the rooms that you do get into who don't like it.
That's right. Absolutely. I think part of my hope with this is that I'm personally not sort of woo-woo about it, right? Like, there are people who would talk about imagination that would be kind of a little more in the clouds about it. And so I think the people that might have a problem with that language, that might want to take it off the meeting agenda, are like very earnest, serious people that think I'm going to make them, I don't know, play summer camp games at a business meeting, right? So I'm not really the build a tower out of marshmallows and toothpicks kind of facilitator. So I think if I get a chance to actually speak with people and we're bringing in neuroscience, we're bringing in strategy, we're bringing in other kinds of evidence for this, it has more gravitas than it sounds like it would have. So I think the people that resist it could be the people that don't give me an opportunity to actually explain what I mean, but also maybe people who benefit from the status quo. And or who are, and this could be me often, I think as adults, we don't very often do things we're not good at. We get promoted and lauded for being adept at things. And because imagination is not something that we tend to be good at, I'm very not good at it. I need to say that right off. I think we resist going somewhere that we feel like we're going to feel like a rookie or look like we don't know what we're doing, because we are so rewarded for seeming competent, and being competent at imagination is a bit jarring for people. And so I suspect there's something about not just maintaining status quo, but saving face, because there's a vulnerability in this. Partly because we're not good at it, partly because what we imagine might sound crazy, partly because it might not happen. And so, lots of Brene Brown's work, for example, would speak to why it is that vulnerability is so important as leaders and why we're so terrible at it. And, I suspect there's something about that. And I think sometimes it's not just overt resistance, it's just people have never thought about it before.
Yeah. I think the status thing is a big deal, especially in men. But not exclusively. Doing something that's not going to make me look good. If I'm the boss, why would I show that I'm crap at something to the whole team? And
we're supposed to have answers, right? We're supposed to know what to do.
Yeah.
And this doesn't really lend itself to that. And so I think it works, like it blossoms in environments where people are willing to be a bit experimental, where they're willing to hold, like they don't value accuracy quite as much as they value some other things like curiosity and creativity. So I think it probably thrives in certain kinds of environments more than it would in others.
And so then the piece around unlearning, which I was exposed to maybe, 8 years ago, a wonderful New Yorker, and the broad New York accent would, taught me this term to unlearn. And it's just like, how does that play out in this space as well?
Yeah. What I know about unlearning comes largely from the work of a guy named Barry, I can't remember if it's Riley or O'Reilly, who wrote a book called Unlearn. And it's one of the elements of this adaptability assessment that I work with, that in order for people to be adaptable, one contributing factor is their ability to unlearn. And the way he describes it is that it's a conscious choice to take beliefs or behaviors that once served you well and set them aside in favor of ones that are serving you better now. And when I hear it like that, I go, yeah, and because when I was talking about driving with the parking brake on, there's an element of that about unlearning where you might be willing through curiosity to let new ideas and new ways of being in, but you haven't necessarily shed the old ways. And so it's almost, I picture them being like a math equation that cancel each other out, where it's like I've brought in some new stuff, but the old stuff's pretty powerful in my brain. And I don't actually have the capacity to hold both from a space point of view. And I also don't, the new ideas can't almost like fulfill their full potential because they're being canceled out by these other competing ways of doing or voices or whatever. And I think of it really practically like an organization that brings in a new, software system. And many people, when they do that, I'll upload the new system, but I'm keeping the old one on my machine.
Right.
Because I know how to use it.
Right.
And so, but then all of a sudden they start calling IT because their computer is really slow.
Yep.
And it's because they've cluttered it up with the old system and the new system. And so I feel like unlearning is the decluttering that allows the new way of being to kind of fulfill its possibilities.
Nice.
And it's very hard to be adaptable. You can be. There's other pathways to adaptability, but mental flexibility is one piece where it allows you to see. We were talking about gray earlier. You can see multiple paths to solving a problem, but unlearning is the way that you clear those paths and let go, like are willing to say, I'm not going to follow all of them. I'm going to choose. There's something I see unlearning as decluttering.
Lovely analogy. It's because, and the other thing is it's a commitment to the new thing, and I wrote about this recently with I took up golf very late, and I've committed to try and get better this year, which means I've got to go backwards to go forward, and I've got to be okay with going backwards.
Yes.
To go forward. And there are times, I'm just, it's just screaming, it was okay before, it was okay before. It was all too hard. This is too hard. And you're fumbling and stumbling and getting worse. And it's just, it's really hard. It's really hard,
It is. Well, and I think a lot of us, myself included, we talk about learning and we say we like to learn, but the learning process, like to actually be terrible at something because you're a beginner, is awful. It's really awful.
Yeah.
And it's like trying to write with your wrong hand. Or for me, I'm not a good ice skater, and if I got out on skates, like my grandson was learning to skate this past winter, and he watches ice hockey on TV with us every Saturday night. And I think he thought as a 2.5-year-old that he'd be able to step on the ice and just skate. And he was so angry that he was, falling all over the place and shocked by that. And I'm thinking, if I was out there on skates, I would be doing the same because I'm not a good skater. And I didn't do it because I don't want to fall on my face. And I think there's something about that where we romanticize learning, but forget that the actual doing of it and learning a new skill and strengthening a muscle that we haven't used in a while or whatever it is terrible. Like it feels awful. And so, speaking of not wanting to be too Pollyanna about things, I'm starting to develop a much more realistic understanding of the learning journey for adults, especially as being like, and that's where I want to be more childlike in this pursuit of imagination, is that they are willing to be awful at stuff and not worry about it. And most of us are too interested in looking impressive and saving face and feeling confident and all the things that come from mastery. And we have to be willing to loosen our grip on that. And I'm terrible at that. I have been rewarded my whole life for being good at stuff. And, actively choosing to be terrible at something is really counterintuitive for me.
Yeah. I went through a period during this podcast when I realized that my power wasn't turned on, and going, how do I do this without looking bad? And then I thought, fuck it. You know what? I can't. And just go with
And did it matter when you said to me, I need to go check my power supply? Nope, doesn't matter at all. I don't care. I don't go, oh, he's not very good at this. It's like, no, go fix your power. It's fine.
But the story I told myself beforehand, right, was just sitting there going, oh, how do I do this without, looking a dick?
Yep. Yeah.
And so that stopped me in my tracks for about 5 minutes, right?
Yeah.
And then I thought, get over yourself and just go and get it sorted. So, we trip ourselves up a lot with this desire to look good all the time.
And we're so much harder on ourselves than other people are, right? I mean, that voice in your head was way nastier to you than I would have been.
100%.
My friend calls it their headitor, her nasty headitor, right? It's the editor in her head that is just, coming at your life with a red pen all the time and telling you all the mistakes you've made. And I know that I think it's Michael Steer's work where he talks about if the voice in our head were a separate human from us, we would never invite them over for dinner. They're just a really bad friend. So I think that's actually true.
It'd be fascinating, wouldn't it, to have the voice in our head actually going along and see what, and people go, oh my God, what
Yeah, they're terrible most of the time. Not always, but terrible. And I have friends who have named that being, right? Sometimes they call them Gollum, or sometimes it's like, for a friend of mine named Judy, she calls hers Judge Judy, because that's a TV show here where there's a really nasty judge. And, there's something freeing about distancing yourself enough from that voice to be able to name it as a separate entity from you. And so you don't believe it quite so much.
Rebecca, what do we need to cover off that we haven't covered off so far?
I made myself a little list ahead of time of the things I hope to talk about, and my list is done, which I'm thankful for. I appreciate that opportunity. But I think the thing that keeps coming back to me is that how fun this can be if we give ourselves space to try it. And what does it take for us to create spaces and opportunities that are safe enough and quiet enough, if I can put it that way, distraction free enough to do it? And so I'll end with a little story, because I had someone contact me a few weeks ago. Her name's Sarah Kent. She's out of the UK. And she's doing this project where she invites women to tell her about a dream they have. And it's not a dream like something they dreamt about while they were sleeping, but like a dream for their life. And so I got invited to have this conversation. And two things emerged from that for me, at least. One of them was that it is good for the facilitator to be the participant. It is good for the coach to be the coachee, right? To experience both the benefits and the terror of what it's like to be in the participant seat. So being invited into a situation where I was asked to imagine and to articulate a dream I have was very helpful and hard, but a good antidote to being the one that's always telling other people to do that, right? So that was good. But the other thing that was so amazing about it was the power of just being listened to for, I think we spoke for 25 minutes. And she just sat there and sort of nodded and asked a little nudge here and there. But for the most part, I sat there for 25 minutes and described a dream that I have. And I couldn't believe, it was almost emotional for me in being able to be given that kind of airtime by someone else, and also to have I don't know if the word is discipline, but have carved out some time to actually put words to stuff that, was in there but jumbled and hadn't actually been spoken aloud. And so the power of creating spaces where people can do that has really come home to me. So it's not just about, hey, imagination's a good thing, but it's also like, what would we need to do to give that as a gift to one another? Because being able to speak our imaginings out loud into a safe space and not feel like someone's going to laugh at us or roll their eyes at us, and they're going to let us mess around and try to find the words and stuff. I can promise you that what I described to her is much more likely to happen. And it gave me a sense than it would have been had we not talked. And it gave me a sense of that dream. I mean, her language was dreaming. It gave me a sense of that dream being both well into the future, probably long after I'm gone, and also very close, because there's parts of it that are already being worked on. And it was really good for me to have that experience of actually doing what I tell people to do. And so I guess that's the last piece I would want to kind of highlight, is knowing about imagination is not going to reap the same benefits for us as actually imagining. And so I just really encourage the listeners to find and create opportunities to actually do that.
Rebecca, can I bring in one other subject before we close off?
Please.
So here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we work alongside Māori a lot. And what's interesting what we're seeing is the Maori economy is growing faster than any other segment of the economy. And one of the things that I've learned from Maori is their strategic view is 100+ years out,
Mm-hmm.
and they are magnificent storytellers,
Mm-hmm.
and and their stories are sometimes for me hard to comprehend
Mm-hmm.
because I've got to do the work.
Mm.
So it's really interesting when I listen to these stories and there's thing for the future. There's a lot of stuff unsaid, and it took me a long time, and I don't fully understand it. But it's really interesting that they leave gaps in the story, like big
Oh, I love
gaps,
that.
and it's just like, and so I'm trying to join the dots.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure I totally get the dots wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but I've realised that I think, and I could be totally wrong, I think those gaps are there on purpose.
Oh, yeah.
So the listener has got to do more work,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I like stories, I like films, I like stories where I've got to do some work.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to know who the murderer is at the beginning of the thing and then
Yeah.
watch the cops figure it out, right?
Yeah.
I want to
Yeah.
do the work. I want to go, oh, it could be this, it could be that, right? And it just, and so it's really interesting that I'm noticing one, their economy is growing so quickly, and
Yeah.
it's not separate, it's integrated, but there is,
Yeah.
it's something there, and so and this um, uh, and so I mean, in New Zealand we're called Pākehā, right? The colonisers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we I don't think our ability to tell stories needs a lot of work,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and I think our stories are it needs a lot of work. We need to get a lot better at telling those stories
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
telling our stories and understanding that stories don't have to be factually correct all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and that you've got license acknowledging it's a story.
Right. Yeah.
So, are you working with your Indigenous people much?
Personally, not directly, but certainly very connected in different ways. Yesterday was actually, on the day we're recording this, yesterday was the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, and I would say that we learned when I traveled to New Zealand. I would say that there are similarities, but I would say that New Zealand seemed, at least to me as a visitor, to be ahead of us in this area. But one similarity I hear from my limited knowledge of that is this idea of that long time span. First of all, our Indigenous people talk about 7 generations as the
Yeah,
appropriate time frame, which would
yeah,
probably be roughly what you were describing.
yeah,
I think, and the storytelling is absolutely true. I think we also need to get better at story listening. I think we aren't as good at listening to story, and also not good at telling story. And I know for me, like, even if I do take time to imagine a desired future, imagine the next chapter, one of the things we haven't talked about much is that I do transitions coaching with people who are trying to stuck in the middle of a messy, transition, and trying to figure out what the next thing looks like. And often, we're so, I don't know, PowerPoint slide driven or something, that we describe it in bullet points, and it would
mm,
be so much more powerful if we described it in story. And I so appreciate what you said about needing to work harder to fill in the gaps, because our brains, particularly in Western cultures, try to create patterns, right? We try to create linear narrative arcs out of seemingly disparate things. And so we connect dots, and we connect dots in ways that, like, we almost feel like we have to, right? It's this, like, we can't not. And I think there are other traditions and cultures that are better than I am, certainly, at leaving some dots unconnected,
Yeah.
and sitting in that, without that having to feel like dissonance in our brains. And the other thing it made me think of was when you're talking about having to work hard at listening to a story or solving a mystery, it makes me think of what's known now as the IKEA effect, that people will feel greater affinity for something that they've worked hard at. And so they will keep their IKEA furniture that they built,
Yep.
and pay more for it than they would if they bought it already put together and, nicer looking and better quality and whatever. But we have some sort of attachment to something that we've worked at. And similarly with people in groups, we know that people who've been through hard stuff together, whether that's adversity or just a challenging assignment or whatever, are bonded by that, right? And so there's something about that storytelling example that you gave that makes me think that there's something about building connection between the teller and the listener in a shared enterprise of making some sense of what's going on, that may have something to do with, with that kind of, I feel like I'm cheapening it by calling it the IKEA effect, because what you're describing is much richer than that. But there's something about building connection through struggle that, and not making things easy for us, right? That I think there's something about that. And, we know that using a muscle we haven't used in a while or building a new skill, we have to be willing to embrace the messiness of that and bring some grit to it. Grit is another element of adaptability, right? And for those of us that may not be as strong in that, we have to be willing to kind of persevere at it in ways that our phone-driven cultures don't strengthen very often.
Yeah. It's a whole nother subject.
It really is.
It's a whole, and it's, I had this conversation recently around the importance of with children to be bored, right? And that it's really,
Jonathan Haidt's work's amazing on that. I was with him at a session at an innovation festival in New York City a couple weeks ago, and was I'd read his work on the anxious generation, but hearing him live speak to it was really quite remarkable.
Yeah. So we could go on for a lot longer, Rebecca, but people will be people who aged while they've listened to this podcast. So, Rebecca, thank you so much for your time. And a shout out to Tiago, who has made this happen. And I was delighted that he had actually listened to a podcast I'd done with a young Māori woman, Bridget Bell. And that was very cool to, somebody from Portugal had, this is the power of the digital world, right?
It's true. The world becomes small when you think of you sitting there in New Zealand, I'm here in Canada, and a Portuguese mutual colleague has found us a way to be together or put us together. And then all the different people that might listen to and benefit from this conversation. I love the ripple effects of that and really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks so much.
I have learnt a lot, Rebecca, and I am going to use the word imagination more, or just use the word, because I haven't used it for a long time.
Interesting.
Yeah,
and I really appreciate the feedback that it caught your attention, because, when you're sort of steeped in something, it's hard to know what's interesting to people or what is unusual. And so I really appreciate that feedback, and I've enjoyed our conversation very much. Thank you for it.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.